Hello and welcome to my channel. This is a charcoal drawing of a Harris hawk, and I'm going to take you through the drawing process. It was a commissioned drawing, and the reference photo was originally a color photo. And this bird has some lovely colors, but the customer wanted it black and white. I didn't know exactly why that was so, but black and white it was. So I started with a sketch, and I worked on my usual paper size, 9 times 12 inches. The paper is a 190 GSM smooth paper, and as for the pencils, I'm mostly going to be using Gioconda charcoal pencils, Koh-i-Noor Gioconda charcoal pencils, the extra charcoal pencil, and the slightly harder Gioconda silky black pencil. This one will be used mostly for sketching and some of the details. In addition to that, I'm going to use a bit of vine charcoal and some charcoal powder. So in the reference there was a tree trunk and some branches in the background, and also some distant treetops on the right, but I decided not to include those. Now, because this has to be black and white and we don't have color, in order to make this drawing look good, in order to make it look interesting, there are two things that need to be done, in my opinion. First, I need to create a great deal of contrast between the background and the main subject. So the background has to be blurry and out of focus, and the main subject really has to stand out, both in terms of the amount of value, but also in terms of the amount of contrast, texture and detail. Here you can see that I forgot to tape my paper to this cardboard, and it was kind of moving around, so I had to make a short break to tape it just so that it would be fixed in place. And after that I started working a little bit more on the background. I covered some of the background with charcoal powder to create a nice even blurry tone, and that's pretty much what the background will look like. I just wanted a little bit of value there so that some of the lighter details would stand out, because the light side of this tree trunk is going to be lighter than the background, and that will help me create some contrast between this tree trunk and the background. So I want to create some depth even in the background, even though the background, like I said, is going to be a little bit simpler. And I cleaned up the left edge of that tree so that there is a bit more contrast between the background and that left edge of the tree. But the thing is, because the background is out of focus, I can't create clean edges, so I had to blur them a little bit. And the way I create blurry edges is either with a tortillon or with brushes. You see, when you use brushes, if you want to preserve a clean edge, you have to point the tip of the brush towards the edge. And if you want to create a blurry edge, you do the opposite. And that way you kind of push the charcoal slightly over the edge, and you create kind of a double edge or an undefined blurry edge, which imitates that out of focus look. There were some other branches here in the background, and I shaded the right side of the tree trunk because that's the dark side, that's the shadow side. I added some texture to the tree trunk, just a little bit, not too much. Like I said, I don't want it too detailed. And then I proceeded to make all of the other details blurry as well. There's going to be another branch coming in front of this tree trunk, about the middle of the height of the paper. But I'm going to do that first by cleaning up the white space for the light side and then adding the shadow side. So back to what I was saying, because I made quite a digression. There are two things I need to do in order to make this look good, even though it's in black and white. The first thing was to create a blurry background and to create a detailed main subject and to have a nice contrast between the main subject and the background. The second thing I need to do is to create a lot of contrast within the main subject itself, because I need a great range of values so that I can show these colors to the viewer. In the absence of colors, in the absence of hue, I have to explain what the bird looks like to the viewer using lighter and darker tones, and that's why it's going to be important for me to have a nice range of value from very lightest lights to the darkest darks. And this soft charcoal pencil, this Koh-i-Noor Gioconda Extra soft charcoal pencil, is going to be a good tool for that, because it'll allow me to create some pitch black tones in addition to some lighter tones, which I will create by pushing that charcoal dust around and by blending, using my blending tools. I'm drawing some details on the top of the head, and then I'm going to blend those with a brush. But my approach here was to put in some of the darker bits first, which is what I often like to do because it helps me make a little bit more progress with the drawing and navigate through the drawing a little bit faster, especially when the subject is a bit more complex. So I like to put in some of the darkest details, and of course I drew the eye, as you can see, because that's one of the most interesting details, and that's one of the details that I like to start with when I draw birds, because I don't really like drawing feathers that much. So when I draw the eye and the head, it kind of gives me a confidence boost so that I can continue. And here I am in the blocking in phase because I'm putting down or covering larger areas, putting down basic relationships between areas of lighter and darker value. So as you can see, the right side is the shadow side. It's going to be very dark, and then the other side, especially around the top of the wing, is a lot lighter. And I also made some indications of shadow areas in between those layers of feathers. And now I'm blending with a brush, and as I'm blending with a brush, you can see how much more realistic and smoother these feathers are starting to look, especially on the top of the head. But I'm going to be doing the same with the rest of the body. So this initial phase where I had to establish some of the tones was an ugly looking phase, but it was necessary because I established the contrast between the larger, lighter and darker portions of my main subject. And it is only after that that I can move on with the drawing of the details, such as feathers, because those are very complex, and you can't do the texture of the feathers and the details on the feathers and then do the shading later, because that would be very difficult and almost impossible. The easier thing to do is to establish those larger, darker areas first and lighter areas first, and then once you do that, then you move in with the details and the smaller contrasts and textures and things like that. I find that brushes are very good tools when blending, when you're drawing either fur or feathers, because the thing is that you can't draw every single hair and you can't draw every single feather, and when you're drawing, it's the same thing when you're drawing human hair or grass and things like that. So it helps you create an illusion of volume and density, which otherwise you wouldn't be able to do if you tried drawing every single feather or every single hair. So that would be very time consuming and kind of frustrating. Now I'm kind of starting to work on these lighter feathers here on the wing, and I'm mostly using our Koh-i-Noor pencil eraser. So let me say a few words about erasers. I'm mostly going to use this pencil eraser here. I also have a kneaded eraser, but this is what I use most of the time. And this is like a pencil, but it has rubber in it and it can be sharpened. And you can see how I'm basically using it in the same way that I would use a regular pencil, and I'm drawing lighter marks instead of the darker marks. So this is first and foremost a drawing tool rather than a correcting tool. And I stacked these feathers, kind of layering them one on top of the other, starting from the smaller ones at the top of the wing around the shoulder, and the longer and larger ones around the middle of the wing. Now these feathers here, as you can see, are two-color feathers. They have some darker details, or rather three-color feathers. They have some darker details on them. So there's the base color, which is kind of like a reddish brown, and then there's the lighter portion around the tip of each and every one of those individual feathers. And then there's a darker area, which is like a dark brown, almost black in some places. And because the feathers are stacked on top of one another, it kind of looks like these stripes are continuing from one feather to the next. So it's a very unusual, very interesting looking pattern. It's a very nice looking bird, but at the same time it's not very easy to draw. But I think it was not that difficult for me. I think I'm probably getting a little bit better when drawing feathers, even though there are some wildlife artists out there who are probably a lot better than me when it comes to drawing birds. But I was pretty happy with the way this came out, considering the fact that it didn't really take that much time and effort to achieve. And now I'm drawing some of the smaller details, again using that pencil eraser that I did most of this work with. It's a very useful tool when you're drawing highlights, and the way you approach things is, as I did, first you establish the base tones and then you add the details using your charcoal pencil for the darker details and the eraser pencil or the pencil eraser for the lighter details. And that way you're creating a very nice range of value and very nice contrast between some of the darkest and the lightest details on the bird. I am also trying not to touch the chest area of the bird on the right too much, because I want that to remain really dark. I added some suggestions of lighter details in there, like maybe some suggestions of lighter feathers out there, but I don't really want to overdo it. And also did some refining using that harder pencil, that Gioconda black pencil, on some of the individual feathers, just to make the texture a bit more interesting. But like I said, I want the right side of the bird to remain very dark so that I could retain that contrast, and that's very important to me because, like I said, in the absence of color, this contrast and this range of value will be extremely important. Already you can see how the main subject is starting to stand out against the background, which is kind of blurry and kind of monotonous, I guess, for the most part. And there's also a very nice edge I've achieved around the hawk's head and the left side of the body. That's also very important if you want the main subject to stand out. Now just adding some lighter details on this lower layers of feathers on the wing. And what you need to remember with feathers is the same thing, or very similar when you're drawing fur on hairy animals, is that the length of the fur varies depending on the part of the body, and the same thing goes with feathers on birds. The feathers on the top of the head and around the beak are very, very short, and they're almost like short hairs. But as you move further down the body, they get longer and longer. They're really long here around the neck, around the tail. Sorry. So these tail feathers are really long. And right now I'm adding in those details, and there's going to be some nice shadows here, which I'm going to refine a little bit later using this pencil eraser. But like I said, the feathers get longer and longer as you move further away from the head. They're a little bit longer on the neck, they're quite a bit longer on the wings, and especially long around the tip of the wings. And here in this case around the tail, they're probably the longest. So I'm using that charcoal powder I used initially to do a bit more shading on the background, because I want to continue with the same tone, using the same tone in the rest for the rest of the background. And the hawk's body for the most part looks pretty good, but all I have left to do is to finish the right side of the background, and then I'm going to tackle that branch or whatever it is that the bird is perched on, and I'm going to do those claws or whatever is visible of them. And I'm just spreading that with a brush. That looks pretty even, but because some of the edges get kind of spoiled in the process, I just add a few details with that harder pencil just to make the edge clean and to make it stand out against the background. And now it's time to put in a few more details on the lower part of the body and the legs and those talons, and of course that tree stump or that branch that the bird is standing on. I erased some of the lighter details, lighter bits, and then I started adding some of the darker bits. I started adding some of the darker textures here. Some of the darker areas, because again we are staying consistent with the light source, and the light source is coming from above and a little bit more from the left than the right. So the lower side and the right side is the shadow side, and that's going to be the case with this piece of wood here as well. But I have to give it a little bit more texture because it's a rough surface, has some tree bark on it, some knots and some broken off branches and things like that. So I first established the basic contrast between the light side and the shadow side, and then I can move in with some smaller, finer details and textures. I also refine the appearance of those fingers and talons, and that's pretty much it for the legs and the hawk's body. Now all I have left to do is this is the details on this branch, and here I'm adding some lighter details using a pencil eraser. This is a very useful tool here for these nice contrasts. And I'm just adding some texture on top of that. And I'm going to add a bit of shadow here as well. The shadow coming from the lower part of the bird's body. So I'm going to add that with a piece of vine charcoal and go over it with a brush, hoping that some of the textures of the of the branch underneath will still come through. And now I'm going back and adding some of the darker bits to wrap things up. The drawing is now finished. I'm going to put my signature in the lower right corner to kind of balance things out, because I have more details in the top left. And that's it. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out my other videos. I'm going to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.